Welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping right in today, and I want you to start by picturing your last vacation.
Yeah, just really visualize it.
Right, think about the exact moment you locked your front door, dragged your suitcase down the driveway, and headed off to somewhere entirely different.
Somewhere new.
Exactly. You spent days or weeks in a new place,
Uh-huh.
and eventually you unlocked that same front door and walked back into your normal life.
Which is the key part of the experience.
Yeah, and you probably called yourself a traveler or an explorer, but the precise word we use for you, a tourist, actually has a completely wild origin.
It really does. It's a brilliant linguistic reality check, honestly,
Right, because it translates to someone who goes in a circle.
which strips away all the romanticism of travel and just reduces it to pure geometry.
It totally does. When you trace the word tourist back from its first English appearance around, I think, 1772, through the Old English Turian and the Old French Tourner, you eventually hit the Latin Tournaire.
And the ancient Greek tornus.
We're the tornos. And a tornos is literally a lathe.
A tool specifically designed for making circles.
So tourism at its absolute core means to leave your baseline spin around the globe and return exactly to where you started.
Which perfectly captures the psychological boundary of what a vacation actually is.
Because you aren't staying.
No, there is an inherent baked-in promise of return. You aren't a nomad wandering endlessly, and you aren't an immigrant seeking a new life.
Right, you have a return ticket.
Exactly. You are stepping out of your reality to consume the other, knowing full well you have a home base waiting for you.
It's a very specific mindset.
It is, and I've actually set up my background today to reflect this exact dynamic.
Yeah?
You might notice a vintage, hand-drawn map of the world that slowly morphs and blends into a glowing, real-time digital flight tracker.
Oh, that looks incredible.
Thanks. It's a visual representation of our mission today.
Yeah.
We are exploring the evolution of how, and more importantly, why we move around this planet for leisure.
Because today's deep dive is entirely dedicated to the massive multi-trillion-dollar phenomenon of tourism.
The whole thing.
The whole massive industry. We are going to unpack its history, which is far older than you might think. We'll examine its incredibly uncomfortable colonial roots, and then look at the bizarre new hyper-niches defining travel today.
Things like doom tourism.
Yes, doom tourism and sleep tourism. And ultimately, we are looking at the massive footprint this industry leaves on our global ecosystem.
It's a force that touches economics, environmental science, psychology, and modern geopolitics.
It really shapes the world.
The sheer scale of moving billions of humans around the planet for fun fundamentally reshapes the physical world.
And for you listening, whether you are trying to figure out where to go for a long weekend, or you are saving up for a massive transcontinental expedition, understanding the invisible historical forces and the profound impacts of your travel will completely rewire how you view your next trip.
You are never just buying a plane ticket.
Right, you are stepping into a historical current. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Where does the actual concept of traveling for leisure begin? Because for the vast majority of human existence, travel was purely a matter of survival.
Right. If you were traveling thousands of years ago, you were likely tracking migrating animals fleeing a drought, trading goods, or marching with an army.
It wasn't for fun.
Not at all. Travel was inherently dangerous. The roads, if they existed at all, were filled with bandits. The elements were lethal, and stepping outside your local community meant stepping away from your only safety net.
Which is terrifying.
But as early as 1500 BC in Egypt, we start seeing the faintest glimmers of travel for pleasure.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but the first true, recognizable infrastructure for leisure travel really explodes during the Roman Republic.
Okay, so the Romans were basically inventing the modern beach vacation.
Pretty much.
The upper class would leave the sweltering, crowded streets of Rome and travel to coastal resort towns. The most famous of these was Baiae, down in the Campania region.
Is by
They built these sprawling Villa Urbanas and Villa Maritimas, massive holiday estates right on the coast or near the Adriatic Sea in places like Barcola.
And you have to picture the opulence of these spaces. These weren't just simple cabins.
No, they were mansions.
Exactly. These were elaborate estates with heated floors, private bathhouses, and terraced gardens looking out over the water.
Wow.
They were specifically designed for leisure political networking and escaping the pressures of the capital. It was the ancient equivalent of the Hamptons or the French Riviera.
And it wasn't just happening in the Mediterranean either. Around the same time, noble classes in ancient China were establishing their own early tourism routes.
Making specific, deliberate journeys.
Right, journeys to Mount Tai. In some cases, the exceptionally wealthy and devoted would attempt to visit all 5 of the sacred mountains.
Which was a massive undertaking.
It was, but this raises a question. If the Romans and the Chinese nobles were figuring out leisure travel, why didn't it catch on for everyone else?
Because it required massive centralized wealth and crucially secure infrastructure.
Ah, the roads.
Yes. When the Roman Empire collapses, the safety of those roads collapses with it. The idea of traveling just to relax vanishes from Europe for centuries.
It just disappears.
Completely. Travel outside of trade and war becomes heavily framed around religion. You don't travel to relax. You travel to save your soul.
Right, the era of the great religious pilgrimages.
Exactly.
By the post-classical era, Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam had developed massive continent-spanning pilgrimage routes. You see this reflected in the defining literature of the time.
Like Chaucer.
Yes. Geoffrey Chaucer uses a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket as the entire framing device for the Canterbury Tales in the 1390s.
And in China, the classic 1592 novel Journey to the West is entirely centered on a Buddhist pilgrimage to India.
Right, so it was travel, but it was heavily burdened with pious duty.
You endured the journey to reach the holy site. The travel itself wasn't the reward, it was the penance.
That's such a different mindset from today.
It is. But human psychology eventually shifts again. We start to see the birth of the modern tourist mindset, the radical idea that the world is something to be observed, experienced, and enjoyed for its own sake.
Just for the sake of seeing it.
Exactly. And one of the most perfectly documented turning points for this psychological shift happens in 1336.
The Ascent of Mont Ventoux by the Italian poet Petrarch. I find this story so fascinating because it sounds entirely normal to us today, but it was deeply weird at the time.
It was borderline eccentric.
So in 1336, Petrarch decides to climb Mont Ventoux in the Provence region of France.
And he doesn't need to hunt anything at the summit.
Right, he isn't running from an invading army, he isn't building a religious shrine, he just gathers his brother and a couple of servants, and he climbs this massive mountain simply because he wants to see the view from the top.
Imagine the local shepherds watching this guy just walking up a mountain for absolutely no practical reason.
They must have thought he was crazy. But Petrarch actually writes an allegorical account of this climb, and he explicitly praises the act of traveling.
He does.
He coins this brilliant phrase to describe the people who refuse to explore, frigida incuriositas.
A cold lack of curiosity.
A cold lack of curiosity. It's so poetic.
That phrase perfectly distills the intellectual awakening of the Renaissance. Frigida incuriositas is the enemy of the tourist.
Because tourists are curious by nature.
Exactly. Petrarch is arguing that there is inherent profound value in simply seeing the world. It is a philosophical justification for wanderlust.
And as that philosophy marinates over the next few centuries, it eventually institutionalizes into what we know as the Grand Tour.
The ultimate aristocratic flex of the 17th to 19th centuries.
It really was a flex. Wealthy young men, primarily from the landed gentry of Western and Northern Europe, would pack up and embark on these sprawling, multi-year treks across the continent.
They were essentially tracing the roots of Western civilization, focusing heavily on Germany, France, and Italy.
But we have to understand the sheer logistical nightmare of the Grand Tour. This wasn't backpacking with a rail pass.
Not at all.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is the scale of it. These young aristocrats traveled with an entourage.
They had tutors, right?
Yes, often called bear leaders, whose job was to keep these rich kids out of trouble.
Bear leaders. That's hilarious.
They traveled with those tutors along with servants, massive trunks of clothes and letters of credit. They dealt with terrible roads, broken carriage axles, and the constant threat of highwaymen.
But the payoff was cultural capital. They weren't just sightseeing, they were extracting culture.
Exactly.
They would spend months in Rome or Florence commissioning paintings, buying antiquities, perfecting their French or Italian, and mingling with the continental elite.
We have a great example from 1624. The young Prince of Poland, Ladislas Sigismund Vasa.
Okay, what did he do?
He takes his massive journey through Germany, Belgium,
Okay.
the Netherlands, France, Switzerland, and Italy. And it wasn't just a vacation. It fundamentally changed his country's culture.
How so?
When he returned to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, he actually introduced Italian opera to his home country.
Oh, wow, so he brought the culture back with him.
That is the Grand Tour working exactly as designed. It was a mechanism for importing refinement back to the homeland to elevate the traveler's social status.
But notice the common thread here, from Baye to Petrarch to the Prince of Poland. Leisure travel is still exclusively the domain of the absolute elite.
The 1% of the 1%.
Right, for the masses, travel is still a grueling necessity, not a choice. To change that, you needed a fundamental restructuring of human labor,
You needed the Industrial Revolution.
which introduces two critical new concepts to the working class: the steam engine and the concept of leisure time.
Because when you regiment labor into strict factory shifts, you inadvertently create the weekend.
Exactly. But how do you get factory workers to actually travel? This is where a man named Thomas Cook completely rewires the world.
Thomas Cook is the architect of mass tourism, but his motivations are what make the story so compelling.
Right, he didn't start out trying to build a global leisure empire.
He was a deeply religious man trying to fix a societal problem.
The year is 1841. Thomas Cook is standing around waiting for a stagecoach in England, and he has a revelation. The Midland Counties Railway had recently opened.
And Cook decides to charter a train, but he's not catering to aristocrats.
No, he organizes a trip for 540 temperance campaigners, people actively advocating against the consumption of alcohol.
He wants to take them from Leicester to a temperance rally in Loughborough.
And the distance was incredibly short, right?
A mere 11 miles.
11 miles. And he charges them exactly 1 shilling per person.
But here's the genius part. That single shilling covered the rail ticket and the food for the journey.
Oh, he bundled it.
Yes. He couldn't legally sell the train tickets at his own price, so he negotiated a wholesale discount with the railway company and packaged it together. Thomas Cook invented the all-inclusive package tour.
Imagine the scene in Loughborough when an open-air train pulls up and unloads over 500 people all at once for a day trip.
It was a logistical triumph.
It really was.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Cook had just drafted the exact blueprint for the multi-trillion-dollar industry we have today.
By partnering with transportation operators.
Yes, he realized the power of the intermediary. He could buy in bulk, lower the barrier to entry, and package it with an itinerary.
It was an absolute explosion. The partnership between travel agencies, transport, and event planning was born.
And it scaled quickly.
Within a couple of decades, by the 1860s, Cook isn't just taking people to local rallies. He is taking massive parties to Switzerland, Italy, Egypt, and the United States.
He establishes what he called inclusive independent travel.
Where you pay his agency a fixed price, and your travel, food, and accommodation are completely sorted. By the 1890s, Thomas Cook and Son were moving over 20,000 tourists a year.
He democratized movement. He took the exclusive privilege of the Grand Tour and repackaged it for the growing middle class.
But this rapid global expansion of tourism brings us to a much darker, heavier reality.
It does.
Because as European tourists started venturing further out into the world, they were traveling along routes carved out by violent colonial expansion.
This is a crucial pivot. We usually associate tourism with cultural appreciation and open-mindedness.
Right.
But the reality is that the early tourism industry was deeply entangled with empire-building power dynamics and the suppression of local cultures.
You have to look at the infrastructure. When European empires expanded into Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, they built railways, deep-water ports, and steamship networks, primarily to extract resources and deploy military forces.
But once that infrastructure is in place, it becomes incredibly easy to send tourists down those same tracks and shipping lanes.
And to justify sending tourists into colonized lands, the tourism industry leaned heavily into a sociological process known as othering.
Othering is a fascinating and destructive psychological tool.
Can you explain how it worked in this context?
It is the process of representing a different culture in a way that establishes your own culture as superior. In the context of 19th century tourism, European travel guidebooks, academic journals, or promotional materials would portray colonized populations as exotic, primitive, and in need of Western civilization.
So they were selling the illusion of danger, but with a colonial safety net.
Exactly. And Thomas Cook's enterprise was right at the center of this.
They published a widely read promotional newspaper called The Excursionist Right.
Yes. When they started selling package tours to Egypt, they framed the entire country as this wild, out-of-the-ordinary spectacle that had been conveniently domesticated for the European traveler.
Domesticated? That is such a loaded word.
It is. The Cook enterprise actually worked in tandem with the British Empire during the military occupation of Egypt. They managed the logistics of moving people up and down the Nile on steamships.
But by marketing Egypt strictly through this binary lens of civilized Europeans observing primitive locals, they entirely silenced the voices of the Egyptian people.
The deep, complex reality of the local culture was flattened into a digestible theme park experience for Western consumption.
I think it is so important for you listening to reflect on this. Look at how destinations are marketed today. How often do travel brochures or even highly produced social media travel influencers still rely on those exact same tropes?
Very often.
The idea of the untamed wilderness or the exotic native culture that is perfectly packaged, sanitized, and waiting to serve you. It is a lingering colonial hangover that the industry is still actively grappling with.
It forces us to ask who owns the narrative of a place, the people who live there or the people who visit.
Historically, the visitors had all the power.
They did, and we don't just see this power dynamic playing out in overseas colonies.
Yeah.
We see the exact same inequalities dictating the freedom of movement domestically well into the modern era.
Right, let's fast forward to the United States after World War II. The automobile is making domestic road trips a cornerstone of the American dream.
The open road.
But that open road was an absolute myth for a massive portion of the population. During the Jim Crow era, Black travelers faced systemic, terrifying barriers when trying to move around their own country.
Because Jim Crow legislation legally enforced racial segregation across public spaces.
This wasn't just about separate seating.
No, it meant that public transport hotels, restaurants, public restrooms, and even gas stations could completely refuse service to Black citizens.
Imagine the visceral anxiety of that reality. You are driving with your family, the gas gauge is dropping, the sun is going down, and you have absolutely no idea if the next town will sell you fuel, let alone rent you a room.
It was exhausting and highly dangerous.
And out of that sheer necessity came one of the most important travel documents in American history, the Negro Motorist Green Book.
Published by Victor and Alma Duke Green from 1936 to 1967. The Green Book was essentially a survival manual masquerading as a travel guide.
It provided a meticulously researched state-by-state directory of the specific hotels, boarding houses, taverns, and service stations that would safely welcome Black travelers.
It was a covert network of safety.
And what is really striking is the corporate intersection here. The sources highlight that the Esso Standard Oil Company, which eventually became part of ExxonMobil, was a major collaborator with the Green Book.
Esso's involvement was a radical departure from corporate norms of the time. They didn't just place advertisements in the guide.
They actively distributed it, right?
Yes, they actively distributed and sold the Green Book at their franchise gas stations nationwide. Furthermore, they actually allowed Black entrepreneurs to franchise their service stations, which helped build out the physical network of safe stops.
It completely reframes how we think about a road trip. The ability to just get in a car, pick a direction, and travel without fear is a massive indicator of social equity.
Absolutely. For decades, the freedom of movement was heavily restricted based on race.
And that concept, the restriction of movement, brings us to the absolute cutting edge of how travel is managed today. The borders haven't disappeared, they have just digitized.
And they are increasingly tied to national security.
Looking at the modern landscape, there is a recent political development in our sources that perfectly illustrates this shift in how borders are managed. And before we dive into this next part, we need to make it incredibly clear. We are looking at a recent political development mentioned in our sources. We are not taking sides left or right, nor are we endorsing these viewpoints. Our goal is strictly to report the factual information contained in the source material to help you understand the landscape of modern travel.
It's just about the mechanics of the border.
Exactly. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection on January 20th, 2025, the Trump administration announced intentions to require foreign tourists from 42 visa waiver program countries to provide 5 years of social media records before entering the U.S.
5 years of records, that is a massive data requirement.
It is, because normally citizens from those 42 countries can enter the U.S. for up to 90 days for business or tourism without going through the lengthy process of obtaining a formal visa.
They just get a quick electronic travel authorization.
Right.
The stated rationale for this policy shift is national security. As the sources note, this aligns with the administration's broader electoral focus on tightening borders and immigration protocols.
But if we pull back and look at this through the broader discipline of security and tourism, we see a profound evolution.
We do. Ever since the September 11 attacks, the entire paradigm of global travel risk management has fundamentally changed.
Tourism security is an entire academic subdiscipline now.
It is obsessed with risk perception, disaster management, and protecting a destination's image.
Because the moment a location is perceived as unsafe, The economic lifeblood of tourism vanishes overnight.
Exactly. And the nature of geopolitical threats has shifted to exploit this exact vulnerability. The sources point out that today island destinations are often more acutely affected by global risks, like terrorism, than continental destinations.
Why islands specifically?
Terrorist organizations recognize that foreign tourists are soft targets with massive geopolitical value. Attacking tourists is a deliberate strategy to destabilize local governments by destroying their economy while simultaneously creating intense diplomatic friction between the host nation and the countries those tourists came from.
Wow, so the friction of crossing a border is constantly being recalibrated based on these massive geopolitical threats.
Yes.
We've gone from Thomas Cook casually chartering a train for a shilling to modern travelers needing to surrender a half-decade of their digital footprint just to get cleared for a 2-week holiday.
It is a transition from physical vetting to digital surveillance.
But here is where it gets really interesting. Despite these increasing political and digital frictions, the absolute volume of global travelers is still so overwhelmingly massive that it is literally breaking the cities they are trying to visit.
This brings us to over-tourism.
We are hitting a breaking point, and local populations are fighting back. The friction is no longer just at the border, it is in the streets.
A glaring example of this occurred very recently. In July 2024, the streets of Barcelona, Spain were flooded with thousands of local residents.
But they weren't celebrating a festival?
No, they were actively protesting against mass tourism.
Think about what it takes to get an entire city to march against its primary economic engine. The core issue driving this is housing.
The explosion of short-term tourist rentals like Airbnbs has completely hollowed out the local housing market.
Because landlords can make significantly more money renting to a revolving door of tourists than to long-term residents.
As a result, the cost of living skyrockets, and the locals who actually make the city function are priced out of their own neighborhoods.
It is the ultimate tragic paradox of the industry. A destination becomes popular because of its unique assets, its authentic culture, its historic architecture, its local culinary scene, and its affordability.
But the sheer unyielding volume of visitors degrades those exact assets. The streets become congested infrastructure like water and waste management is pushed to the brink, and the relationship between the host community and the guest sours into outright hostility.
The sources specifically use the term tourism phobia.
Tourism phobia. It's a recognized negative attitude towards tourists.
When you have massive cruise ships pulling into a historic port and dumping 10,000 day trippers into a city center for 6 hours of aggressive consumption, any pretense of cultural exchange evaporates.
The locals feel like extras in a theme park.
And because travelers are increasingly aware of this tension and are frankly getting exhausted by generic overcrowded mass tourism, we are seeing a massive pivot toward hyper-specific niche tourism.
Niche tourism is the industry's response to the homogenization of travel.
People no longer want to just go to a crowded beach and fight for a towel space.
They are seeking out highly personalized, specialized experiences that cater to very specific psychological or physical needs.
The examples in the research are absolutely wild. Let's look at sleep tourism.
Sleep tourism.
People are so fundamentally burnt out by modern life that they are traveling across the world specifically to sleep. They check into specialized resorts and medical clinics in places like Switzerland or wellness retreats in Asia purely to get holistic help for snoring insomnia or general exhaustion.
It is a stark commentary on our daily lives. The ultimate luxury vacation is no longer seeing the Eiffel Tower. It is 8 hours of uninterrupted REM sleep.
Then you have DNA tourism, which really exploded around 2019 with the rise of commercial ancestry kits.
You spit in a tube, find out you have 22% West African heritage or 14% Scottish ancestry, and you immediately book a trip to physicalize those results.
It is an attempt to anchor your personal identity to a geographical location.
It is a deeply personal, inward-looking form of travel. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, looking entirely outward, is space tourism.
Dennis Tito kicked this off back in April 2001 when he paid to fly on a Russian Soyuz spacecraft, becoming the first official space tourist.
And now you have the private sector aggressively pursuing this. Companies like Virgin Galactic are building craft like Spaceship Two, selling seats for around $200,000 for a brief suborbital joyride.
A 2010 report anticipated this could be a billion-dollar market by 2030, though the logistics liability and insurance frameworks are still a massive hurdle.
Space tourism is driven by extreme wealth and future-facing optimism.
But there is another micro niche that is anchored entirely in present-day anxiety, and it is arguably the most sobering trend in modern travel: doom tourism.
Also known as last chance tourism.
People are rushing to physically witness fragile environments before climate change erases them from the map entirely.
This trend was formally identified around 2007 by major publications like the New York Times, and the demand has only accelerated.
Tourists are flocking to see the retreating glaciers of Patagonia, the melting ice cap on Mount Kilimanjaro, and the bleached coral of the Great Barrier Reef.
They want to see it before it's gone.
The layers of irony here are just devastating. You have a traveler who cares enough about a melting glacier to fly across the world to see it.
But the act of taking that long-haul flight, utilizing local transport and consuming resources at the destination, pumps massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere.
Their desire to witness the destruction creates a feedback loop that actively accelerates the exact destruction they came to see.
It is a tragic paradox. And as the climate destabilizes doom, tourism is transitioning from an ethical dilemma into a very real physical danger.
Because the environments people are rushing to see are fundamentally unstable.
The sources provide a terrifyingly recent example of this. In August 2024, an American tourist was visiting an ice cave at the foot of the Breiðamerkurjökull Glacier in Iceland.
And because of warming temperatures, the structural integrity of the ice was compromised, and the cave simply collapsed, killing the tourist.
It is a stark, brutal reminder of the physical realities of a warming planet.
Which forces us to look at the macro scale of the industry. We have to confront the sheer environmental and economic weight of global tourism. It is a trillion-dollar double-edged sword.
Let's look at the economics first, because the scale is almost hard to comprehend. As of 2011, tourism accounted for a staggering 30% of the world's trade and services.
That is massive.
It makes up 6% of overall global exports of goods and services. It is an invisible export.
An invisible export. I love that framing. When a tourist travels to Vienna and buys a coffee or a museum ticket, that country is exporting a service without shipping a physical product across a border.
For entire nations, this invisible export is the absolute bedrock of their economy. It sustains millions of jobs in hospitality, aviation, and cultural preservation. In many ways, heritage is the ultimate renewable commodity.
The sources highlight a great concept: Habsburg cells. The lingering fascination with the historical Habsburg family and their imperial legacy generates an estimated 60 million euros a year in tourism revenue for Vienna alone.
You see the same thing with the British royal family, whose heritage brings hundreds of millions of pounds into the UK economy annually.
But we cannot ignore the environmental bill for all that economic activity.
A landmark 2018 study published in the journal Nature Climate Change quantified the damage. Global tourism is responsible for roughly 8% of all global greenhouse gas emissions.
8%. That encompasses the aviation fuel, the cruise ship emissions, the air conditioning in the hotels, the transport of the food tourists eat, and the souvenirs they buy.
And crucially, the vast majority of this massive footprint is generated by travelers from high-income countries.
This is what is driving the urgent push for sustainable tourism and ecotourism. The industry is desperately trying to figure out how to minimize the ecological damage while ensuring that the economic benefits actually stay within the local host communities.
The guiding ethos is exactly as the sources phrase it: take only memories and leave only footprints.
But implementing that on a global scale is incredibly difficult. Because while tourism is an economic juggernaut, it is simultaneously one of the most fragile industries on Earth.
It relies entirely on the uninterrupted movement of people.
Right. So what does this all mean when a crisis hits, the entire machine seizes up?
And we have never seen a clearer demonstration of that fragility than the COVID-19 pandemic.
The statistics from the World Tourism Organization are staggering.
In 2020, there was a 70% decrease in international travel. By April of that year, 165 out of 217 global destinations had completely shut their borders to international tourists.
The financial hemorrhaging was unprecedented. Between January and October of 2020, the United States alone lost an estimated $147 billion in tourism revenue.
Spain lost roughly $46.7 billion.
Across the entire continent of Africa, countries collectively lost about $55 billion in just a 3-month window between April and June 2020.
Millions of livelihoods evaporated almost overnight. It laid bare just how deeply interconnected the global economy is and how precariously it balances on the simple premise of people being willing and able to travel for leisure.
It is a lot to process. We've traced this incredible phenomenon from ancient Roman elites lounging in coastal villas to a poet climbing a mountain for the view to Thomas Cook democratizing travel on a temperance train.
We've unpacked how tourism infrastructure facilitated the harmful othering of colonial expansion and how domestic travel was fiercely restricted during the Jim Crow era, leading to vital lifelines like the Green Book.
And we've seen how today it encompasses everything from the digital border walls of the 2025 social media policies to the protests against over-tourism in Barcelona to the desperate rush of doom tourism as our planet warms.
It is a powerful, complex, and beautiful force.
So as we wrap up today's deep dive, I really want you to think about all of this the next time you sit down to plan a trip. When you click book on that flight or that short-term rental, consider the invisible footprint you are leaving behind. Think about the historical privileges that allow you to hold a passport and cross a border. You are actively participating in a massive, ongoing history of human movement.
And as we look toward the future, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to consider.
What's that?
We are watching the compounding crises of climate change, the escalating carbon cost of aviation, and the fierce local pushback against mass over-tourism. If the physical environments we want to visit continue to degrade and destinations begin heavily rationing the number of bodies allowed inside their borders, we may be approaching an era where physical leisure travel reverts to being a rare, heavily restricted luxury.
Which completely changes the landscape.
It does. With the rapid acceleration of technology, will the tourists of the late 21st century have to rely entirely on hyper-realistic virtual reality to explore the world? Will the act of physically leaving, going in a circle, and returning home, the very definition of the tourist, eventually become a relic of the past?
A completely fascinating and slightly terrifying reality to imagine. Thank you so much for exploring the intricate world of tourism with us today. Keep your curiosity warm, keep questioning the world around you, and we will see you on the next deep dive.